Okay, welcome everybody to George Washington's Virginia Roots with special guest, historian John Maass. I am Sheila Budoff with the Arlington County's 55 Plus program, and I'm delighted to welcome you. I'm also very delighted to be partnering once again with Bridget Wisdom, Library Associate with the Arlington Public Library, to bring you this program. We've partnered on a couple programs, and she is an absolute delight, and I'm so pleased she could be with us this evening. Please note that this program is being recorded, and the recording will be posted at a later time on Arlington County's 55 Plus YouTube channel. Our presenter will be spotlighted so that only his image will appear in the recording. And now I'm honored and delighted to introduce our special guest for this evening, John Maass. John is a historian at the National Museum of the U.S. Army. Before that, he was a historian at the National Museum of the, at the U.S. Army Center of Military History in Washington, D.C. He's written many books and also scholarly journal articles about military history, covering the Revolutionary War, Civil War, French and Indian War, and more. Today, he's going to be discussing his most recent book entitled George Washington's Virginia, about Washington's many connections to the Commonwealth of Virginia. And this evening, he's going to focus on one particular chapter of his book, highlighting George Washington's relationship and many connections to Virginia's Fairfax family. John holds a BA in history from Washington and Lee University, an MA in US history from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and a PhD in early American history from the Ohio State University. John has also served as an officer in the US Army Reserves. And so without further ado, I am going to turn over the program to historian John Maass, and we will be spotlighting him.
Okay, thank you, Sheila. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, good. Well, good evening to everybody. Thanks to Sheila for inviting me for this joint program. Glad to be here. No group discussion on George Washington and colonial Virginia would be cutting into my time, so don't worry about that. I'm glad to be here. And it's interesting to kind of gauge the interests of folks in our area who are interested in Washington. This book came out in 2015, and Sheila invited me to speak, I guess, back in the wintertime, I think. So 5-6 years after the book came out, and so people are still interested in hearing about this, which is really nice. It's an interesting topic, especially to folks who live up here in Northern Virginia. Also glad to meet Bridget from the library. I think Wisdom is a great last name to have if you work in a library, so that's good to hear. And also volunteer at the Army Museum. Before we get going about the Washingtons and the Fairfax family, notice I use the term Washingtons because George Washington's oldest half-brother, Lawrence Washington, also had a connection to the Fairfax family. So we'll get into that shortly. One of the reasons I wrote the book, George Washington's Virginia, which has several thematic chapters and various connections of Washington to Virginia, is, excuse me, the allergies are starting to get to my throat. I have a chapter in about Old Town Alexandria, the frontier in Virginia during the French and Indian War, the Yorktown campaign, Washington as a legislator in colonial times, and Washington as an entrepreneur. So tonight we're going to focus on just one aspect that I wanted to talk about, which is Washington's relationship with the Fairfax family, because it's important to remember that at the time Washington was becoming an older teenager and soon to be a young man in military service for Virginia, his family was considered to be part of the gentry, but certainly not the aristocracy along the lines that the Fairfaxes were, and other families like the Lees, Carters, Randolphs, Custises. But this connection with the Fairfaxes really helped make Washington's early career and set him on a trajectory for almost all the accomplishments he had after that. Okay, so first, let's talk about the Fairfax family. When we talk about Lord Fairfax and the Fairfax family and the Northern Neck land grant, who we're really talking about is the sixth Lord Fairfax. That was Thomas Baron Cameron, sixth Lord Fairfax. And there you see when his date of birth through death. We're really talking about him. So anything in this area named either Fairfax or Cameron is named after our guy here. And this was the Lord Fairfax that George Washington knew. And the Fairfax family came to the colonies because of this large land grant, which I will get into shortly, and will show you a nice map of how big it was. Lord Fairfax was the only English titled nobleman ever to reside permanently in America. And he's also buried in Winchester. So he took up residence. He was never married. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And he moved to America in 1742. So this is after the Fairfax family inherited the Northern Neck in 1719. And that was through the Lord Fairfax, the fourth Lord Fairfax. That was through his marriage into the Culpeper family. And the Culpeper, you might recognize that from Culpeper County and what have you. The Culpepers were granted an enormous charter, a land grant in Virginia for helping King Charles II regain the throne of Britain, England. And for years of overlapping claims and what have you, it was finally cleared in 1719. So by the time of 1742, when Lord Fairfax was in his 30s, I'm sorry, in his 40s, late 40s, he moved to a place called Greenway Court, and that is out in Clark County. I've misspelled Clark here. I'm just realizing that. Near Winchester and Front Royal. It's between Winchester and Front Royal. And remember, at this point, that is a rural area. The only town of any size out there was Winchester. There was no Front Royal. There was no Strasburg, any towns along the Harper's Ferry, anything like that. So Fairfax moved to America and eventually settled at this location called Greenway Court. Now, he did not have any children of his own, and he was never married. So before building Greenway Court in 1748, he moved to the area now known as Fort Belvoir, and that's named after Belvoir, the plantation that William Fairfax, his nephew, built. Lord Fairfax was given the land grant, which we'll talk about in a second, and he needed someone to act as the agent for the land sales. So this big giant grant was not something he was going to farm or manage. It was all about land sales. And he brought down his cousin from Salem, Massachusetts, William Fairfax. And it was William Fairfax that built Belvoir, not Lord Fairfax. I see this shown incorrectly on signage and books and that. People, even tour guides that I've listened to. This was the Fairfax, William Fairfax, that built Fort Belvoir. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, this is the site of the actual Belvoir Plantation House. And this is not far from the Officers Club along the river at Fort Belvoir. If you have access to Fort Belvoir, you can easily walk to this place. There's lots of interpretive signs there, very well done actually, and some improved trails. It's only about, I'd say about 100 yards off of the street. And as you can see, there's nothing standing. There's some mounds that you can tell where the original house was, but it's pretty well interpreted. And that's along the river, downstream from the Officers Club, really not that far. So this is part of what you can see today of the Fairfaxes, and that's one of the things I'll be stressing is a few things out there still to this day that you can see that are related to the Fairfaxes. So let's move on to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about what was going on here. This is an artist's conjectural drawing that was done, I believe, in the 1930s that show what Belvoir would have looked like. And the part that's at the bottom of this illustration, you can see those are the cliffs going down to the Potomac. So this shows the elevation of the house from the riverside, not the approaches. But this description of Fort Belvoir here was written by Washington, and he describes it, and this is how they came up with this possible look of what Belvoir would have looked like. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is a drawing scheme and a plat of the house that was done after archaeology and partial excavation. It was covered up again to preserve the remains of the place, which is very common in archaeology. And this also shows the brickwork that was done as a cross section of the brick that would have been at the water table, which is about 3 or 4 feet up off of the ground, where the brick kind of kicks in one row. And this was all found at Fort Belvoir. And you can see it's not really a huge house. There were a few dependencies, but not really a huge house. But anyway, it was considered to be one of the finest on the Potomac. Certainly, it was made of brick, 2-story Georgian. It had that Georgian symmetry in the forecourt and the outbuildings. So an interesting plan here that we can still look at today. Okay, next slide, please. Now let's talk about William Fairfax. He's the land agent, and you can see he was born in 1691. He and his family had lived a long time in the Bahamas. He was at one point the customs agent for the crown, became chief justice because of his law background, and eventually governor of the Bahamas, before moving to a healthier climate in Salem, Massachusetts, and was the customs agent there as well. So he transferred to Virginia and was assigned as the Virginia customs collector for the Potomac River. And then for Lord Fairfax, he became his land agent, the person that was going to record the deeds, sell, make everything legal, and sell land to those who could afford it. His first marriage was to Sarah Walker, and she died in 1731. That was quite a little bit of time before they actually came over here, about 10 years or more. And they had 3 children. And these are the folks that George William, which is William's son, he was slightly older than Washington, several years, and he was the one of the Fairfaxes that George was very close to, probably his best friend in his late teens, early 20s, into the pre-revolutionary years. He also went on various surveying expeditions with George Washington. Again, several years older. Then there was Anne Fairfax and Sarah Fairfax as well. And we'll talk about their marriages in a little while. William Fairfax, his second marriage was to Deborah Clark, and she died in 1747. and they had 4 children who you can see right there. These children of the second marriage weren't really close to Washington. So, okay, let's move on. So we see that. So let's go back to Lord Fairfax. This illustration at the bottom is a largely conjectural account of what Greenway Court looked like. Lord Fairfax called it a hunting lodge, but you can see it's a little bit nicer and bigger than your average hunting lodge today. Anybody named Lord Fairfax wasn't going to really be slumming it out in the frontier. So he had some creature comforts. Again, it's in Clark County. The location can still be found, and the Clark County Historical Society occasionally has this one of the outbuildings out there open on special events. So it is available to be seen at some time, but it's not really seen from the road, and this building here is not standing anymore. So Lord Fairfax and his nephew, William Fairfax, were really mentors to George Washington, and they needed somebody out there that could survey the land, because without a survey, the land really could not be sold. You had to get a plat. And many of Washington's surveys, when he was a young man, are still in existence at the Library of Congress and can be seen digitally. He became the surveyor of Culpeper County when he was 16 years old, no doubt appointed based on the recommendation of Lord Fairfax and William Fairfax, who William Fairfax served on the governor's council, had very large influence. This is a very wealthy family, a lot of pull. And back then, Culpeper County was huge. It included what's now today Rappahannock County, part of Fauquier County, and other counties in that area, Greene County, Madison County. So it was a huge area, but that's who they got because Lord Fairfax at Belvoir was very, very close to where Washington lived as a young man with Lawrence Washington at Mount Vernon. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this is a really cool map. It's part of the signage out at that Belvoir plantation site. And what you can see here is a modern map of Virginia, and superimposed on that is the land grant that was called the Northern Neck. So most folks in Virginia who are familiar with the Northern Neck today know the Northern Neck as the area on the bottom right-hand side of this map, right? And that is what we call the Northern Neck today, between the Potomac and the Rappahannock, southeast of Fredericksburg. But the charter for the Northern Neck, the grant, said that the land would be all land between the Potomac and the Rappahannock, and a straight line going from each of those rivers' sources. So you can see the yellow star down at the bottom. That's the source of the Rappahannock, and that's up right at the base of Shenandoah National Park. The yellow star at the top left is the source of the Potomac River, and a direct line was surveyed between the two. And just so you can get an idea of where that is, if you're familiar with Virginia geography, that line even today separates Shenandoah County from Rockingham County. So the county that Harrisonburg is in and the county that Woodstock and Strasburg and Newmarket are in, that's a straight line, and that's a remnant of the old Fairfax line. So it was 5.2 million acres. And that was the grant that was given to Lord Fairfax, and that's what Washington started surveying a lot of. Most of the land that Lord Fairfax and Virginia, for that matter, wanted to settle first in these was in the Shenandoah Valley, the lower part of the Shenandoah Valley, for roughly from the area of Newmarket and Woodstock all the way to the Potomac. And so that would include around Winchester, but also what people wanted was bottom land along clear running creeks, streams, and rivers. So the south branch of the Potomac was surveyed and settled. Patterson's Creek that runs into the Potomac near Cumberland, Maryland. The Opequon, which runs from Winchester into the Potomac. All these places, the Shenandoah River. This is where Washington spent a number of trips, lived rustically in tents and camped, and met Native Americans for the first time in that area for fires and what have you. But this is where he really cut his teeth. And you can see the size of it to gauge the scale. Within this black line, you can see at the upper left or the left kind of northeast corner where the star is from Mount Vernon, that red line is Fairfax County today. So you can see that this encompasses Prince William, Stafford, parts of Greene, Madison, Culpeper, Fauquier, Loudoun, Clark, Warren, Frederick, parts of today's West Virginia, Shenandoah County, Page County. So quite an area there. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So this here is an original map of the Northern Neck that began survey. Washington did not survey this, but several surveys were done of the Northern Neck so that Lord Fairfax could register those back in London and clearly delineate where his land was. Because colonial Virginia was replete with overlapping land claims, confused titles, different kings issued different grants for different people. That was notorious in New Hampshire, but Virginia too. And the farther you got out from the settled areas along the coast, you had to mark surveys with surveying equipment, but also take as sighting points and reference points things that are mentioned, such as the large oak tree or the huge rock by such and such a creek. They had to be descriptive. So this map is oriented, if you're trying to figure this out, north is on the right side, not the top of this map. So you can see there's Georgetown on the Potomac, and then the Potomac, it follows it upstream to Harper's Ferry, where the Shenandoah comes in from our left right there. Yeah, there's Harper's Ferry. But this was the original one. You can kind of, if we twisted this counterclockwise, one turn to the left, it would match up with that other chart that I showed you that was superimposed on the modern map. This again is a Library of Congress digitized map. So, all right, next please. Okay, this is the stylized kind of more finished map and of the Northern Neck again. And again, this would have been sent back to England, not only to register in London, but also to attract investors. So several copies of this map were made, and you hopefully by now you're kind of picking up on the shape of it, the shape that here. You probably can't see it here in detail. I have another detail coming up in the next slide, but they're all little notations on here after the map was printed in handwriting. So you can probably see those. This was George Washington's copy of this, and all the notations in here are in his handwriting. And if you'd like to get a great look at this, you can go to the Library of Congress website, which is www.loc.gov, search under maps, and the search terms should be something along the lines of Northern Neck map Washington. And this will be one that pops up, and when it does, it's a huge file, and you can open it up and see in great detail, close up, all his little notations on here. So it's very interesting, very valuable to me when I was working on the colonial period, was trying to find Washington sites. So if we slide on to the next one, this is an expansion of it, and you can see for example, at the top, you can see where he writes Loudoun and County. Loudoun County was not formed until after Fairfax arrived in America. And just a couple other things that I've put on here where you can see Belvoir is on the river down on the bottom right, and Gunston Hall just below that. You can see a little house there. In fact, if you really look closely, you can see 3 houses in a row running up the river. The first one's Mount Vernon, the middle one's Belvoir, and the bottom one is Gunston Hall, which was the home of George Mason. Other thing, I just put a few on here because I didn't really want to clutter this map all that much. But one of the places you can see there where it says Watts, that's Aldi, just to give you an idea. Aldi was a tavern way back before the Revolution called Watts Ordinary or Watts Tavern. So you can see that. And then another one that I put there is Tolston Grange, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. This will be one of the cool sites related to Fairfax that you can see if you try to look for it. You can see the Falls of the Potomac on the map there. That is what we call Great Falls today. Difficult Run is where this house is sitting on, called Tolston Grange. And Difficult Run was owned by BF, the initials, and that's Brian Fairfax. It was a 5,000 some odd acre plantation out there. And he eventually moved closer actually to Mount Vernon and Belvoir in his later years in Alexandria. And we'll talk about him in a second, but this kind of shows you Washington's notations out there. The dotted lines are trails and roadways, usually one wagon width wide. It's hard to say. And these are the routes that Washington would typically take to go to the Shenandoah Valley. And normally, especially once Leesburg was established, the route he would take was typically roughly equivalent to Route 7 until he got just before or until he got to the area near Aldi and a place called, I'll think of a second, Waterford and that area out there. And he would go to the northernmost gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which during that time was called Vestal's Gap. And Vestal's Gap is maybe 10, 15 miles south of Harper's Ferry. And from there, he would go either to Winchester or, when he was a military officer, points farther west. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Remember Tolston Grange on the map, because we'll be getting back to that. The Fairfax marriages also tie the Fairfaxes into the Washingtons. Most significantly was Anne Fairfax marrying Lawrence Washington in 1743. They lived at Mount Vernon. Anne Fairfax was 15 years old when she got married and moved to Mount Vernon. As most of you know, Lawrence died in 1752, meaning Anne and their children inherited Mount Vernon. Anne Washington moved there, however, in before 1754, because Anne was remarried to a Calvert and moved to Maryland. So she basically leased the land to George Washington. And eventually, all of the children that Lawrence and Anne had, there were 4 of them, all of them wound up dying in childhood. And so did Anne, died as well, fairly young, before the French and Indian War, or I should say, I think I want to say 1761, I believe. So that's how George came to get Mount Vernon outright, was her death. Sarah Fairfax married John Carlisle in 1747, and most of you in this area probably know that's the Carlisle house on Fairfax Street in Alexandria. It's on the very block north of King Street, first block north of King Street. And John Carlisle was a very wealthy Scottish merchant, and actually had a dock behind the house because the Potomac River came up to what is now Lee Street in Alexandria, back then called Water Street. He was also a militia officer during the French and Indian War. He was a commissary agent, meaning he supplied the troops from Virginia out in the Shenandoah Valley, and also did some of that as well during the Revolutionary War. And finally, George William, who was, again, Washington's friend, close in age, Lord Fairfax's great nephew. He married Sarah Carey from Richmond, who went by the name of Sally, and they lived at Belvoir. And Sally is the one, we won't really have time to get into it tonight, but she's the one that many have speculated that was Washington's great love interest and what have you. So again, that's a different story, but that's where they were, at Belvoir. They actually stayed in Virginia to about 1773, when George William, through his father, who died in 1758, and others, inherited many more properties, or I should say several more properties in England, and moved back to England on the eve of the war, and did not return to America. And Sally Fairfax wound up living some 40 years or so. I'm approximating that because I don't have that handy, but afterwards. So these were the marriages of the Fairfaxes, and as you can see, one of them was to Lawrence Washington, who died in 1752. Okay, next, please. Now back to Brian. Brian became the 8th Lord Fairfax, and he again lived out near the Great Falls area. And in 1757, he was given Tolston Grange with 5,500 acres. And that's along what's now known as Difficult Run. It was back then too. And it was east of Difficult Run, within what's today Fairfax County as well. He opposed American independence, but stayed in Virginia. He married Sally Fairfax's sister, Elizabeth Carey, in 1759, and he lived at Tolston Grange from 1768 to 1790. Now, when I was doing the George Washington book and looking for these places, I did find out the location of the place and from various websites and Fairfax County Historical Society, other publications. And I wanted to go out there and find it. So I looked and looked and looked where I thought it was. And all I saw was basically a neighborhood that looks like houses from the late 80s, early 90s. I could not figure this out. I had an old image of the place from the Civil War times. So I had that with me, and I was looking for a story and a half with bay windows up top. 2 by 2 next to the doorway. Could not find it. Finally, I went down more of an access road to a neighborhood, and as I turned around, that's when I saw what you see in this picture here. It's been extensively added onto, and the addition is toward the Tolston Road side. So the house is at 1213 Tolston Road. It is privately owned. There's no access to it. There's no historical marker there. However, when you go down this other neighborhood road, you can absolutely see it. And that's it right there. So he lived here until 1790, when they moved closer to Alexandria. Alexandria and Mount Vernon. Okay, but this is still standing today. Okay, next, please. So Brian Fairfax moved to a place called Mount Eagle, which you can see here in an image sometime in the first half of the 20th century. Now, this house, as you can probably guess, has been added onto many times, and that's why you see the size of it. It looks much closer to a modern house than a house from the 1790s. But Brian Fairfax and George Washington were very close. Brian Fairfax actually became an Episcopal minister after the Revolutionary War, even though he would, eventually assume the title of Lord Fairfax. It was very interesting that someone who was titled to be the Lord would be a minister and stayed in America. But this house here was built again prior to 1790. It was demolished in 1968. And I'll have another image for you in a second before we move on. But those of you who know Alexandria, if you get off the Beltway in Alexandria and head south on Route 1, you cross Huntington Boulevard, which goes toward the metro. As soon as you cross Huntington Boulevard on that corner, on high ground, there are the Montebello condos. They're high rises up on that high ground, built probably in the 60s or 70s. And but most folks know where Montebello is, in the Alexandria Fairfax area anyway. Well, that's where this house was, and it was torn down as part of putting up those condo towers and apartments there. And I believe we go to the next slide. There should be, yeah. So this is actually a Civil War era map, watercolor. And you can see Alexandria at the top right. And you can also see where there used to be a bridge going over Hunting Creek. Right, exactly where the arrow is. Now, Hunting Creek is not nearly as wide as this anymore. There's been a lot of fill in there. The parkway goes across here to the right of this map. But at the time of the Civil War, it was a little bit bigger than that. And the high ground to the left is where Fort Lyon was, but just a little bit below that, it was where Mount Eagle was. So anyway, before we wrap up and go to questions, a couple other points I wanted to make, but we'll just stay on this slide. Belvoir was basically empty once George William Fairfax and Sally Fairfax moved back to England. And George acted as at least partial agent of selling a lot of the possessions in there, because it was just too expensive to transport them back to England. The Fairfaxes weren't hard up for cash, as I'm sure you can imagine. And things like furniture could get damaged on the trip over. So a lot of the items such as that were sold. During the Revolutionary War, the house caught fire, and there were ruins of it for quite some time, and a lot of it demolished during the War of 1812, because when the British came up the Potomac River in August of 1814, the part of the Virginia forces put artillery positions right along the bluffs where the Belvoir house was located, and they used some of the materials and old bricks and stone and what have you to make field works and cannon emplacements when the British were in the Potomac River between basically Belvoir and Fort Washington. So Washington wrote even as late, even by the 1780s, 1790s, he wrote to Lord Fairfax, to George William Fairfax, that it was just a melancholy scene to be out at the Fairfax site, because he had enjoyed so much the company there, and he knew Sally and George William, and he was a brother-in-law to Anne Fairfax, knew Lord Fairfax. But interestingly, again, Brian Fairfax and Lord Fairfax did not support the Revolution. Now, normally, Virginia, as did many of the other, if not all the 13 new states, they acted to confiscate the property of loyalists, which they call Tories in a lot of situations, and they confiscated their property and sold it at very, very low prices. And they used that to help finance the debt that they were accruing to basically fight the Revolutionary War and to pay off debt afterwards. So the Fairfaxes stayed loyal but they must have had some sort of tacit understanding with Washington and Virginia authorities, because they were never removed from they were never banished. And Lord Fairfax maintained possession of his property, and died in 1781, and was originally buried near the town of Greenpost, which is White Post, which is near Greenway Court, but eventually was moved to the Episcopal Church in Winchester. So with that, let me just wrap up my portion. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to see if I can answer them or direct you to the right way to go.
Thank you so very, very much, John. That was really fascinating. Really enjoyed it. Very informative, and we
Great.
appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask a question. If you've been muted, you can unmute yourself and just call out your question, or if you prefer to enter it in the chat, I can monitor the chat and answer and repeat, call it out and have John respond. Oh, we have a shy group tonight.
I must have covered everything.
I think you must have. A couple of questions on this particular map. I noticed a lot of stockades. I guess that's because this was from the Civil War.
Right. Up on the left there, which occupies now basically the position very close to the Huntington Metro Station. And that was Fort Lyon. And that was on a high hill. If you think about it, when you're going by the Huntington Metro, behind the metro stop is very high ground, and that's where it was. So this was part of the Civil War defenses of Washington, which was a ring of forts and earthworks and other positions, and all around Washington, both on the Virginia side and the Maryland side, and into DC, of course, too.
Wow. And I had another question. There was a Sarah Carey that you had mentioned.
Yes.
Who went by Sally. And I'm wondering if Carytown in Richmond is from that family?
Right. Very wealthy family in that area. Carytown actually is named after Carey Street, and Carey Street is named after the Careys. The main patriot in that family during the Revolutionary War years was Archibald Carey, and he was a state officer. I want to say he was the treasurer or on the council, but their land was primarily in the neighborhood of what's now Manchester and Chesterfield County down there.
Interesting. Okay, well, I don't want to hog all the questions, so I'd like to give someone else a chance. Again, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your question.
This is Patty Clark.
Hi, Patty. Go ahead.
Do you have any information about surveying George Washington might have done along 4 Mile Run?
I don't have that, and I don't really mention anything in the book. However, if you go to that Library of Congress site, loc.gov, and search under George Washington surveying, they not only have a lot of copies in digital format that you can download on yourself and study them, but of his surveys. But there's also a little background of George Washington's surveyor that they did a long time ago. So that might be a great starting point. I have some images in my book of images that he surveyed, but I can tell you this: if he didn't personally own land wherever you're questioning, or it wasn't done as part of his work with the Fairfaxes, which was basically from the time he was 16 to the time he was about 19 or 20. I'm not really sure at 4 Mile Run he did, but that I do not know, and it might be a good place to check out.
Thank you.
Okay, we had one brave soul. Do we have anybody else? Please, if you have a question, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, it looks like we have some in the chat. So one of them is, do you have any information
Thank you.
on the Rising Sun Tavern in Fredericksburg, which I believe was owned by Lawrence Washington? Yes, that was actually owned not by Lawrence Washington. Lawrence really did not have much to do with Fredericksburg. I believe that was owned by Charles Washington. And the Rising Sun Tavern is an historic site, which you probably know. I think this is Steve asking this question. Steve, you probably know that it's a restored building. But that was, I do mention that in my book on a chapter of his Fredericksburg years. His Fredericksburg years were from about the time he was 8 to about the time he was 15 or so. I'm approximating there. And even though Alexandria, for good reason, likes to say that Alexandria was George Washington's hometown, well, when he was younger, he was really a Fredericksburg guy. The farm, the ferry farm out there on the north bank of the river, where he lived, as part of Fredericksburg. His brothers had property and lived there. Lawrence, his father owned a large area for the purposes of iron mining out in the area in Stafford County, which is close to Colonial Forge High School. So George definitely had some, and his brothers. Also, his brother Samuel had a plantation east of Fredericksburg, kind of where Caledon State Park is. Interestingly, other than John Washington, I know Charles and folks on the program might know better than I do. Charles and Samuel, they moved out to the area which is now near Charlestown, West Virginia. Charlestown being named after Charles Washington, and took up plantations out there because the land was so fertile. And Brother George had been out there looking around, surveying, and told him where all the best land was. And Washington owned 1,100 acres on Bullskin Creek or Bullskin Run, now in Jefferson County, West Virginia, but part of Virginia at the time. The other question, what was the relationship between Washington and Lady Fairfax? Do you think he loved her, or were they just friends? Well, Karen, I would say he had strong feelings for her, but knew it was, acting out on that was improper, especially because she was his best friend's wife. He did write the one letter that went about as far as he ever did in expressing anything to her. This was after she had moved back to England, and people point to that and say, well, this is, for 18th century, this is really racy and hinting. But at the bottom of the letter, or the reverse side of the letter, is a note from Martha Washington saying hello. So it's probably doubtful of that, but I do not know the answer. One interesting thing, though, and you might have already heard this, that letter was found after Sally's death among her possessions, or in a desk drawer or something after she died. She kept that for 50 years. Now, if it was just a friendly letter, not sure she would have kept it that long. But anyway, good question, though. Any other questions? All right. Well, I want to say thanks for having me. And if you're interested in more on that, I certainly recommend a few books. I immodestly recommend my own book, but also there's another great book by Robert Madison called Walking with Washington, and it shows the exact location and a lot of times it's still the standing building of all Washington sites in the Alexandria area, particularly in Old Town, and he has 200 sites listed. So it's a small paperback, very well done. I recommend that one as well. So there's some good stuff out there.
Thank you so much, John. This has been wonderful, and we so appreciate your sharing with us your knowledge and your expertise and being so kind and generous with your spare time in the evening. This was really lovely. We
Glad to do it.
appreciate it very, very much. Many thanks again to Bridget Wisdom of the Arlington Public Library for partnering with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you for everyone on this call for joining us. It was delightful. Join us again soon. Take care, everybody. Stay well. See you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.